what we're going to talk about. All right, and welcome back to the Modjeska School for Human Rights. Tonight, we're actually going to get a bit more in depth with what the Progressive Network itself has been doing since the 1990s. Now, as I have noted before, the meeting dates for our class often coincide with key events in American history, and today is actually no different. May 18th is actually the day on which in 1896, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that separate but equal was actually constitutional. So go figure, one of the foundational legal texts of modern American history was cited on this date well over 100 years ago. But what we're talking about is actually bringing us up to the present day. And the thing about modern history, very recent history, is that this is the kind of history that especially falls down the memory hole. It's very easy for folks to know about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, so on and so forth. But the history of the 1990s and the 2000s is actually very recent, and especially talking about what's going on in South Carolina in terms of activism and radical political action in the 90s and 2000s. Now, I saw on Twitter rather recently that there was a joke going around that some people were joking that to join, say, the Democratic Socialists of America is kind of the invoked thing for those on the left in the last 4 or 5 years. But folks were saying, you know, if you were true leftists back in the 1990s or early aughts, being in the DSA was not the cool thing to do. On the contrary, it was very much a very lonely experience. But thinking about activism in South Carolina, which has been at the heart of much of our conversation the last few weeks or so, thinking about how that comes up to the present day in the 90s and 2000s up until right now is the hallmark of today's class. And I think what you're going to find in thinking about the Progressive Network's mission, what it has been up to since the mid-90s, it really mirrors how activism across the country has tried to navigate what has otherwise been a somewhat conservative era in American politics and to an extent in American culture. But again, a lot of what the Progressive Network is doing is not just in the context of South Carolina history, but it is certainly also within the context of American and indeed world history too. So I think tonight, actually, our class will be a bit more from Brett. This actually goes back to what we discussed last week in terms of hearing from activists. But certainly tonight, what we want to also do is hear from you guys as well. If you have any thoughts about what we're discussing, certainly any questions, we always want to entertain those. But again, a lot of what we're discussing tonight will be events that you may remember, may have heard of, but you'll certainly get a different perspective on this evening. Brett, the floor is yours. And I think
I'm the one that has to talk. I want to preface some remarks by the setup, what got us to the network. And we went over GROW, we went over the period where I met Modjeska in the early 70s, and there were old anti-war activists and human rights and civil rights activists and old socialists involved in the starting of GROW. And so it's important to know what was going on at GROW when we started the Progressive Network. And that last topic that we discussed last class was the rise of the Christian Coalition in South Carolina and their involvement in the 1994 general election. And we were pretty well taken aback by the fact that the conservative elements of the Republican Party in South Carolina became very, very, very religious. And that this is an era of Pat Robertson and Tammy Faye and Jim Baker and Newt Gingrich's contract with America. And it's referred to as the Gingrich Revolution. We call it the Contract on America. And that we watched the Republican Party in South Carolina change from this more rational, conservative element, business-friendly people that they are, to being really more focused on those issues, those wedge issues, sometimes referred to as God, guns, and gays, and lifting the lid and looking at that. What happened was the organization within the evangelical churches stepped up and got their members to participate in the grassroots of the Republican Party. And they did what the progressives and the liberals in South Carolina didn't have the discipline of doing, which was attend their precinct meetings, get elected to be an officer in their precinct meeting, then get elected to be an officer in the county Republican Party, and then get on the state board. And they took over the state, the executive committee of the South Carolina Republican Party. And it became pretty well mandatory, certainly mandatory enough that all of the candidates that swept into the House in 1994 and the governor's office were endorsed by the Christian Coalition. And that was a learning moment for people to realize that there was a long way to go in terms of burrowing into the Democratic Party or to offset that work that they did, just learning about the discipline, and that the work at Grow had been openly critical. I mean, we were socialists, openly socialist, and openly critical of the Democratic Party Incorporated and the hypocrisy that's driving it and the inherent racism that was driving it. And that it was real clear to us that was basically benefiting the same class of folks, which was rich white people, rich white men. And so we entered into the discussions about, well, what do we do now? Because there wasn't a progressive statewide organization. We had, in 1994, we had started the Progressive Network. No, we had started Point, the publication that we had, that we started in 91, and we mentioned that a little bit in the last class. But the Point was the only thing that I'm aware of that was a statewide progressive publication that was distributed with the intent of building a statewide progressive movement. And we, Becky and I and volunteers, drove the thing to all over the state. UPS did all over the state. Printed, depending on how much money we had, 20, 25, 35,000 copies. And I recall the one that David Beasley, we printed before David Beasley won. And it was had a cover. We had some really beautiful covers that someday there'll be a portfolio of, drawn by really competent either cartoonist or clever artist in South Carolina. Quashie Campbell of Charleston did a cover for us of David Beasley, and it was stunning, like an oil picture of Beasley. And he was in clerical robes and kind of backlit. You could see his horns. And the story was about David Beasley and his rise to power. He'd been a Democrat all his life until the line to be a Republican officer was shorter than the Democratic line. He got elected to the House as a Democrat in college and ran for governor and won. But I had done an interview and spent time in the Darlington neighborhood where he grew up, talking to people that said if you didn't go along with voting for David or whatever his daddy wanted, the daddy owned the bank and the bank owned all the mortgages, and there'd be foreclosure on your house. And there was a gentleman that told me that I put in the Point, and you'll have to forgive me for speaking truth here because this is what they told me and this is what I printed. He said, well, it's a fine old Southern tradition for daddy to buy his stupidest son a seat in the legislature so he doesn't fuck up the family business. And that was David. That was David. And he just as pleasant a guy and a fraternity guy as you'd like to meet, and fairly clueless. And so the idea that we were going to create the statewide movement in 94, we had meetings at the Grow building, and Joe Neal and Gilda Cobb Hunter were at the table, as well as the president of the AFL-CIO and other people that we'd been working with for a while. Joe and Gilda had been elected in 92. And they were the first genuinely progressive legislators since Reconstruction. And that is something that's real important to understand because it helps put the progressive development of South Carolina in some perspective, because in the 60s and in the 70s as an activist, I was working with progressive legislators or knew of them and had comrades working with them both in Georgia and North Carolina. And there weren't no black legislators until 1970. And the three that got in the door were actually, I have newspaper article I pulled up that referred to them as more acceptable. And so the black folks that got elected in 1970 were more acceptable to the Democratic Party. And that opening was forced by the United Citizens Party and people organizing it. And Modjeska was involved in that, and I was, and Jim Clyburn before he became important. And so we talked about doing a progressive network and wrote a grant and got a $20,000 grant in 1990. It came in 95, right? And we spent a year setting the table to have a meeting to form a progressive network, set a date at Penn Center, had, I think, 28 organizations at the table when we started. And we spent a long time trying to pick a name for the thing. And as you can tell, we never came up with one. And so the effort to start a South Carolina Progressive Network as a descriptive adjective became the proper noun. And so we're open to better ideas, but we are now the South Carolina Progressive Network. Started as a C3, a 501c3, which is restricted from political action. And we've always had a individual membership component that was not restricted to political action. And I wanted to bring up the screen. I'm going to share my screen with you. And so here we are at Penn Center. This is the room that Martin Luther King had many wonderful meetings in. We've got fantastic pictures of Dr. King and Joan Baez and Andy Young right here on this stage. And this is where we founded the Progressive Network. This is 96, the meeting. And my first experience with Penn was in Beaufort High School in 11th grade in 1965, going out there with some friends to watch from the car Dr. King speak at the corner there where it's now Martin Luther King Boulevard runs into the main road through what was then called Frogmore. And there were just thousands of people of color around the stage they built. And in the distance, not too far distant, was a cross the size of a phone pole being burned by the Klan. And that was my introduction to what was going on at Penn Center. Shortly thereafter, in the 68, 69, I was meeting there with the Southern leadership, well, SCLC and the people that were working with them at the time, and SNCC. I remember having a meeting there with John Lewis when he was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I was working with the Southern Student Organizing Committee. So we have deep roots at Penn Center, and we will get back there someday. And that there's Joe Neal and a much skinnier, younger me and Gilda Cobb Hunter at that first meeting. And so the idea of having a C3 was the research and development aspect of our work, and then the C4 is the boots on the ground. The way we paint it is that the C3 listens to people, understands the problems, analyzes the problems, come up with solutions to deal with the problems, and that the C4 members, the individual members, like everybody in the school now should be a member when they leave the school, you're the boots on the ground to implement the policies. And the thing that is really critical, I think, that sets us aside from an electoral or campaign-oriented organization is we'll engage a fight, sometimes knowing we can't win it, but we engage the fight to raise consciousness and strengthen our relationships and to contribute to building a movement and articulating that which it is that is our value. There's not enough of that going on. And so we would take on fights like the clean elections. The clean elections campaign was one of the first ones we did that was talking about money in politics. It was real clear that money is driving politics. And we were working on a bill. We actually introduced a bill. That's Senator Clementa Pinckney, the senator that was killed in Mother Emanuel. He was one of our early members, very young when he came in. It's an amazingly wonderful person. And Joe Neal was his mentor. And Clem was the Senate sponsor. And Joe was the House sponsor, Joe and Gilda, of a bill for publicly financed elections. And very simply, it would be people that refuse or promise and don't take any private money would get a grant to run for office that was equal to the amount that was averaged that was spent to win that seat. Tremendously good idea. Several states are doing it. They've opened up their legislative bodies to rank and file working people. And it's a good step towards democratizing your election process, which of course is not acceptable in South Carolina because you'd have to convince the legislators to give up money. And that in '98, we were the last state that to have electronic filing. And so to look at campaign records, you had to go into the ethics office, sign into the ethics office, put down whose files you wanted to see. They would bring them to you, and then they would tell the person whose files you were looking at that so-and-so was looking at them. And that was their protocol. And Representative Neal introduced a bill for electronic filing. And the response in the legislature was, well, we don't have money for that. And the network got a grant, a $10,000 grant. And I asked the fellow that was running the Ethics Commission if we could make some copies. He said, sure, what do you want? And I said, everything. And we rented 2 copiers and hired a bunch of students and some senior citizens and literally spent 600 hours copying everything in a full election cycle and sent it to the National Institute for Money and State Politics. You need to make a note of that. The National Institute for Money and State Politics is based in Helena, Montana, and it's the go-to place, one of the only places that you can actually go and look at South Carolina legislative. You have a lot of people that are doing congressional, but this place does state. This is the influence of state campaign money on state elections. And you can go to their website is followthemoney.org, and you can go there and type in your name and see everybody you've given money to, type in the candidate's name, see who they've given money to, type in the corporation's name, see who they've given money to. And what you'll find out is that the really wealthy people that are doing really well ride all the horses. It's like the big law firms, McNair firm and the Nelson Mullins firm, they give maximum contributions, so do the utilities, to both parties. So no matter who wins, they win. And the breakdown, we actually, in getting this data and having it posted, it opened the door for the next year for them to find the funding. And they created the hardest to work website ever created that is absolutely worthless. But you can go to followthemoney.org and find out much more about it. You can even aggregate it by the type of industry and find out who's paying for whom. And the last time we ran the numbers, it looked like about 2 or 3% of the money that's coming in an election cycle comes from citizens that give less than $200. 15% comes from self-financing the campaigns by politicians. And the remainder, 80% plus, comes from corporations. And so the question then is, well, who owns the elections? Well, it would be the people that pay for them. And so that kind of makes it clear about who writes the rules and who benefits from them here. So that's an example of things that we do that we don't think necessarily we're going to win what would be categorized as a great victory, but we win along the way by educating people. We also find ways to go around the obstructions. And the voting machines was a big fight. And after the Hanging Chad debacle in 2002, the Help America Vote Act was passed that gave all the states money to unify their system. And South Carolina was the first state in the nation to spend their money. We got 48 million and we dropped about $32 million on this first set of machines that you've heard so much bad stuff about that we had for 15 years. They are like banned in other states, and that there was no paper trail and the memory was rather shaky. We objected to the machines. We presented expert witnesses. We lost the fight. But we've been engaged in the voting issue since before the Election Commission was created in the early 70s, and we've been engaged in that process from the beginning. And one of the things that I think is real important to know, and that it's real important that we don't demonize everything and everybody, or we can't really appreciate the rareness of something actually functioning. And the problems that we're hearing around vote suppression, the top 4 states, 5 states that are allied with Stacey Abrams out of Georgia with her Fair Elections campaign, All of those states have elected officials running their elections. All those states have Republican secretaries of state. In Georgia, where Stacey was running for governor, she was running against the Secretary of State who was in charge of the election. He was running for, and he found a whole bunch of people that didn't need to be on that shouldn't vote, threw them off, big court fight, didn't get them all back on. That can't happen here. That can't happen here. One reason is that we don't elect the people that run the office of the elections. They're appointed by the governor and they serve at the pleasure of the governor. The woman that's running now, and I think she may be just the second person that's been there in the years and years and years it's been there. And so the relationships that are built up between us, other people too, but between us and the state election office and the counties, the 46 counties all have an election office, has changed markedly in the 20 plus years we've been doing this. They were afraid of us when we came in the door a long time ago with these bills like early voting and things like same-day registration where you could vote and register on the same day. These kind of progressive things that made it easier for people to vote that were just slapped down all the time by the legislature, because you have to realize that if you're playing a game and you won the game, why would you want to change the rules? And that's the dynamic that we refer to as the intransigency of incumbency. And we find that in both Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats and Republicans have won with the existing rules, won with the existing voters. And so if you kind of freeze everything right where it is, they're going to keep winning. And so that's the intransigency that we'd run into. And the election commissions, I think I've mentioned before, have different complexions, figuratively and literally, in the 46 counties, because the Ben Tillman Constitution of 1895 made the senator, the one senator of each county, gave him the power to appoint 3 men of good character, which would be white men, property owners over 21 years old, to appoint the people that were in charge of the elections, and they were the ultimate arbiters of voting in that county. So that notion of the counties being the ultimate arbiter is still in the Constitution. And it's only been since 2013 that we were able to get legislation passed that we had hoped that we could turn the election director of each county, that is now hired by the board of each county, that is appointed by the legislative delegation, which means that you're going to have some Republican delegations and some Democratic delegations coming up with different complexions within the people that are running your election. And we thought that it would be a really good move to have each of the directors be state employees and answer to the state election commission. We couldn't get that through, but we did get a bill that says that if it is brought to the state election commission's attention that one of the counties is doing something illegal or against established procedure, that the state shall step in. And that had not happened until 2016, when the election director, Marcy Andino, asked me to sue them. And she knew that we had been working for years to try and get Greenville County to quit or to allow people to vote that lived on campus. Greenville County, if you lived in a dormitory, they would not let you vote from the dormitory, and they would make you go home to vote. And if you lived in a different state, they would say, well, go home. And that's illegal. And so anyway, the state couldn't get them to stop doing it. I talked to Andino about it. She said, well, there's a law. I said, there's a law that you now have the power to do that. And she said, I don't want to be the judge. Sue me. And so we sued her. And much to our pleasure, her office showed up. The county gave their argument as to why the students should have to go back to Tennessee to vote. And the state stepped up and said, we sided with the plaintiffs, that be the Progressive Network, this morning, and have issued an order for them to cease and desist doing this in Greenville County. And that was at the election prior to 2016. It was the first time since Ben Tillman wrote that Constitution in 1895 that the state told a county to quit doing something illegal. And so we're taking some credit for that one. And we've recently been asked to, we've sued over extending registration to the hurricanes. We have discussions going on about a lawsuit in Charleston because they keep conjoining precincts. So rather than have a precinct for each couple thousand people, they're putting multiple precincts in a high school. And we're treading lightly on that one because we want to find out actually what the people want. And so the relationship that we now have with the Election Commission is literally collaborative, because they've realized at this point that the incumbent legislators are trying to make their job harder. I mean, they're debating bills. They're actually debating bills to, well, the photo ID bill is a great example. I won't go into that, but the photo ID bill was an absolute total hoax designed to suppress the vote. We won, but it appears that we lost. The judge that wrote the majority opinion when the Department of Justice refused to allow South Carolina to implement the photo ID bill, it was because the network had found 11 people that couldn't vote. One of our allies in Sumter found some more. And we were the first state of Texas Texas put their photo ID in place without running into the Section 5 criteria of pre-clearance. Texas was pre-cleared, Georgia was pre-cleared. They couldn't find anybody that couldn't vote. We spent a year finding people that couldn't vote. We beat them in justice. Justice Department said, you can't do this. Nikki Haley appealed to the District Appeals Court in DC that hears all the appeals for Justice Department rulings. And they rewrote the law in the courtroom. And they created an exception. And the bill says that the law, the act that they issued to allow the photo ID bill to go forward says the photo ID law does not require photo ID to vote. And the person that wrote that bill, I didn't realize at the time, he very smart, cut the baby in half. So he stopped the thing from stopping people from voting, because all you have to do is have an excuse or vote absentee on paper, and you don't even have to have ID. But the confusion was rampant, that people think you have to have photo ID because they kept saying you have to have photo ID. So they won the battle of confusion. And the lawyer was this guy named Bert Kavanaugh, who people came to know a little later. That was in 2014. And so the voting stuff is something we do a lot of. We're have boots on the ground, and people in this class can volunteer to help with our election protection hotline. We're the sponsor of the 866 Our Vote number. That is a nationwide thing that all the big organizations, national organizations belong to, and we're the command center for South Carolina, where we can watch the calls coming in. We got 1,100 calls in 12 hours on the 2008 election day, and that's a lot of calls. And most of them are stupid voters. Some of them are stupid poll workers, and a few of them are actually malicious. Bad things happening. And so we have like the Justice Department SLED on the phone and can intervene. It's interesting, so stay tuned to that when you're thinking about helping out. The election protection hotline will be in place for the primary as well as the general election, and we need people to help monitor that. So I'm going to pause right there and see if there's questions about voting before we talk about some other things.
Well, there are certainly a few questions in the chat as well that have.
I can't monitor the chat while I'm talking, Robert, if you'd help me with that.
Well, okay, so we've got a few questions. I'll start with Cecil first, because he actually asked a really good question a few minutes ago about building up the progressive network. He asked, as you developed the SCPN, how did you reach out to build your membership? More specifically, is there any real reason why the SCEA wasn't a partner in that effort? I've never understood why there's no connective tissue between the two groups.
Excellent question, Cecil. There's a picture in the Modjeska book that Becky wrote of me and Modjeska and Coretta Scott King on a stage in 1984 this was a send-off from the Masonic Temple, a bunch of people there, to go to the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington. And no, that was 63, so it was 83. And in that picture is this fellow named Joe Vaughn, who was the president of the South Carolina Educational Association. We have a long-standing relationship with SCEA. And you've been involved long enough to know that, and this is an issue that's applicable to virtually any other nonprofit organization, is that your relationship with that organization is somewhat predicated on who's running the show at the time. And there have been presidents of the SCEA here in South Carolina that were terrified about looking like a union. They were afraid of unions. They were raised at fear unions, and they were, oh my God, this is a union. So anyway, that's the answer to your question. It comes and goes. It needs to come again. And this is an opportune time for us to do a mea culpa here, is that in South Carolina, there's so little money and so little resources. This is one of the reasons you keep hearing me all the time, is because I've had the hard-headed perseverance, plus the blessing of being arrested and put in prison and beaten up a lot of times and having a police record, that I couldn't get a real job. And so this is what I had to do. And it's worked fine for me. And I hope that it's been beneficial for the state. But it doesn't really help develop a very large capacity amongst the nonprofits that are working for social justice. There is no other organization like South Carolina. There is no established Black social class conscious organization in South Carolina. And that when we do election work with nonprofits, the people at the table in 2018 for the general election were the SCEA, Rita was there, the Sierra Club, Planned Parenthood. I'm stretching it. The League of Conservation Voters was there, but that's it. That's it. And we're the only indigenous one. All the others are national organizations. And so the lack of capacity within the nonprofit movement in South Carolina has led us to let our C3 base, which when we started with the 28 organizations in the room, those organizations don't last. And that we're really ready to focus again on building our C3 back up. And that's something, Cecil, congratulations, you're going to help us do. And that we in our bylaws, which when you go to the network's homepage, I'd have to leave this screen. When you go to the network's homepage, you click bylaws at the top and you can read the C3 bylaws, the C4 bylaws. Really good plan. We've done it before. We want to get back to doing it again, where the organizations like SCEA that become a member of our C3 have a seat on the board. And so that board at one point was unwieldy, but we have an executive committee that board elects. And that is a more wieldy thing. That is now what's been running the operation since we have let the C3 thing fall apart. So we've got some work to do to pull it back together, but the work that we've been doing in the meantime was strengthening the individual membership in the C4. And it was done in part because of that lack of C3 strength, and also to bring in more troops and to raise more money, because there's only a limited amount of money you can charge dues for, because there's a limited number of C3s. Cecil, I hope that answered your question. Robert, what else?
Oh, so there are a couple other questions in the chat. I think there's one from Omari that I want to hold later on in the class, where he asked about civic engagement amongst the various folks who are in the class this evening. But I think that's a good question for us to hold on to for later on this evening. There's a second question from Cecil that brings us back to your point about incumbency. And I think this is actually a question Dr. Shaw could also weigh in on too. So this is the question. I'll read it for you guys now. I arrived to lobby at a legislature in 2003 and heard, as part of my acclamation to that institution, of an agreement between the Legislative Black Caucus and the Republican then minority caucuses around redistricting following Operation Lost Trust. It was explained to me that this agreement was the foundation of a numeric equilibrium that facilitated the Republicans taking the majority and maintaining it through today. The senator who enlightened me of this sequence of events identified then Representative Don Beatty as one negotiator of the agreement. To the extent that any of this story was accurate, would you offer the context and any details?
Yeah, that's true. It's a true story that there was in the 90s, there were at least 3 different redistrictings. And this is something that Senator LaVenus speaks to. And if you stay engaged with us, you'll get to hear Senator LaVenus talking about fair maps. He's one of our big supporters. 30 plus years in the Senate. And during that time, we're getting to where the need to pass the audition with Justice Department. That's in the 90s. We're still bound by having everything pre-cleared, and the main tripwire for pre-clearance is the term that the feds use is if something that you do has a retrogressive effect on black voting strength. And so you had to prove to the feds that black folks still had a vote. But what was unfortunate was, and this was the unfortunate consequence of creating majority black districts, so it would ensure that a person of color would win, was that the black people then could vote, but they were all picking the same person. And so it diluted the strength of their vote. And that's easiest to see where Jim Clyburn has 63% of his district as people of color at a time that when there were 6 seats, Clyburn had 1, and a third of the people in the state are people of color. There should have been 2 if we were being proportional. And so rather than create another one, even when we made the 7th district, we packed more blacks into Clyburn's district. And so the Justice Department allowed that. And that partisan gerrymandering is something we just heard the Supreme Court say, well, that's up to the states to fix. So that brings us to the difficulty we have in fixing the gerrymandering. But that's essentially a true story. There's some people of color that were legislators then and now that don't particularly like to hear that. And that the people that we're working with, Gilda Cobb-Hunter et al., and they have not that many et als because the Black Caucus, Gilda and Joe quit the Black Caucus. They quit the Democratic Caucus and started the Progressive Caucus, which is now no longer. Joe passed and Gilda said she didn't have time for it. But essentially the Democratic Party is not a party. It's not a party. It's not doing anything except watching out. The incumbents are watching out for themselves. And that we're quite frank about that. There are no permanent friends or no permanent enemies. They're just temporary allies up there in the main. So I'm going to get back to this list over here, Robert.
Okay, sure.
It mentions here that we have a Progressive Voter Coalition, which is our political action committee. And the individuals that are members of the Progressive Network can do that, and we do that. And in 2000, Gilda and I started a Progressive Caucus of the South Carolina Democratic Party. And that it's real important to understand that we've never wanted to own the Democratic Party Incorporated. That we bought George Washington's line. He said, don't start parties, or you're going to end up with 2 that fight amongst themselves for money and power. We would like to see, we're anti-partisan. And so we would like to see the votes be more direct and the people's representation be more direct, and that the diminution of money in politics would be a great help to having citizen legislators. But a lot of changes that need to be made. And meanwhile, what the game in town are the parties. And so we want the people. And we know that I've been a delegate to every convention since '78. I nominated John Roy Harper to be chair of the South Carolina Democratic Party, probably in 1980, or it was in the early 80s. And it was at a time when there were maybe 1,000, 1,200 delegates in the room. And with no preparation, I pointed out that Don Fowler, who was everything you could be for the Democratic Party. He was the chair of the party. He became the DNC rep, the head of the DNC chair during Clinton. And he was also ran an advertising agency whose largest client was the nuclear waste dump, chairing a body that had passed a resolution to close the nuclear waste dump. And so that level of hypocrisy was readily apparent. And John Roy Harper had a good turnout. And as we proceeded in organizing a Progressive Caucus years later, it was the largest constituent group in the Democratic Party is women of color. And so we were able to control the floor of the convention between 2000 and 2014, embarrassed them terribly. And things like the national platform supports gay marriage and the Medicaid expansion. And we couldn't get the leadership of the Democratic Party to support gay marriage. It wasn't in 2006, huge fight. We caused a huge fight on the floor. And that we were able to build such strength and embarrass them that after the 2014 election, when we embarrassed them because their candidate for governor, Vince Shaheen, didn't support Medicaid expansion. He said, I can't touch Obamacare because I got to win 2 or 3% of Republicans. Out of the hell with those 700,000 people of color that aren't voting. They're going to vote for me anyway. They don't have anywhere else to go. And so after that, the Democratic Party Executive Committee had a meeting and they wrote bylaws and created caucuses. There were no caucuses other than us part of that. And they had caucuses now for everything you could think of, that the chair of the party appoints the chair of the caucus. The caucus has to have officers from each congressional district that are officers in the party. And the job of the caucuses was to support the candidates. And we said, we can't do that. The candidates don't even support the platform. And so we quit. And to the best of my knowledge and belief, there's no functioning caucuses that are really working. There are a few people doing stuff. So we're ready to reorganize and come back. This is something when we left in 2014, we figured there'd be a time for us to go back to get the people and give them some leadership and let them be leaders in a, in a movement that has more substance and truth and justice than the Democratic Party can manifest. So we do have a political game. We play it very shrewdly, very sharply. We've won 5 or 6 of the last 6 or 7 elections. I can't quite remember, but we picked them. We picked them very carefully. We'll talk about that later with our Fair Maps analysis and our Missing Voter Project that really knows what's happening with elections. We have by the way, in 2016, our elections were the least competitive in the nation. 10% of the seats are possibly able to change, give or take a few. 131 of the seats have little to no competition. We started the school in 2015, the Modjeska School, and there's Wayne, and there's Daniel, and there's Tootsie Holland, and the Mary Bolden is one of our officers. And Mary, I don't know if she's with us tonight. The projects that we've been doing, again, are all geared towards movement building. So the Missing Voter Project, since it started, has been looking at what the federal government calls historically underrepresented communities is the term they use. So a 501c3, nonpartisan, can take grant money or raise money and still retain their 501c3 status if they don't support a candidate, a party, and they can't target political districts. They can target underrepresented communities. And so it's quite clear in South Carolina, the most underrepresented community is people of color. And so our analysis has led us to understand that the reason people of color are so underrepresented in South Carolina is that famous Constitution of 1895 that Ben Tillman wrote with the express purpose of disenfranchising people of color. And he even said at the time, it's too bad we're throwing out the poor white folks, but that's collateral damage. And that the lack of participation across the board is in part due to the fact that the government doesn't deliver. And that the government doesn't deliver because they don't have to, they're not forced to. And that our work is to reach those people that aren't participating because it doesn't do any good. And to get them engaged in movement building around policy work that affects their lives. And so we can bang on certain policy issues and perhaps get something changed that is going to take longer to change than an election cycle, and that we don't organize around election cycles. That's one of the shortcomings of having the party structure when you don't hear from them until they want your vote. And so that historically underrepresented constituency that we've been mobilizing for years is people of color. And the work that we're doing this year with the Missing Voter Project is really, really significant and important. This would be a place where Omari could speak to the work that we're doing with the Missing Voter Project this year, which is really unique. Omari, are you out there? I know he's out there.
Yeah, you broke up, Brett. I missed that last portion.
Yeah, we were talking about the Missing Voter Project and its origins, focusing on historically underrepresented citizens. And I will mention in passing while you're catching up with me that we did in 2012, did the Missing Voter Project at the at the bus station at Laurel and Sumter in Columbia, because there was a initiative on the county ballot to fund public transportation. And we registered over 500 bus riding citizens and worked on that issue for a long time. And that issue won. We organized them around a policy that affects their lives. And so what are we doing this year in 2020, Amari, that's different? You're working on that.
Well, as we all know, which is why we're here on Zoom, we're in a new world of organizing and communication. So right now, we're zooming, pun intended, we're zooming in on Fairfield and Saluda County, where we have some people on the ground already, and it's going to be a collaborative effort with the NAACP. So essentially, the goal is to get some drum majors, some people who can really carry the torch locally, who know the terrain, who can not just do the voter registration piece, but really do the political education piece, which is pretty much the first pillar of, educate, agitate, legislate. So Fairfield has a pretty high percentage of young voters in that 18 to 26-year-old range, about 26%, 200 and something, I forget how many voters they have that were active in the last election. So we're going to try to zoom in on them. And then Saluda is a little more smaller county, different kind of demographic. They got about 50 plus people that we want to zoom in on. And we want to give them a brand of MVP, let them kind of adapt it to their locale, collaborate with the NAACP and their foot soldiers on the ground, and let them kind of have ownership. But we'll definitely provide the support and the tools to engage the other inactive but registered voters, and to definitely get on some new foot soldiers who haven't been registered.
Well, thank you, Amari. Yeah, Amari is the co-chair of the C4 and a graduate of the Modjeska School a number of years ago. And it's this project we're doing in 2020 with what he referred to as the Drum Majors for Justice is a spinoff of what Dr. King, when he used the term, he was using it in a disparative way of saying that the drum major instinct drove people to want to be at the front of the parade. He said, if you're going to call me anything, call me a drum major for justice, doing it for the right reasons. So we're identifying these young people that voted. There's only statewide out of 203,000 people, 11% of young people are turning out. And so their parents are turning out maybe 40% in the 4-year election. And we're at a point where the young people simply aren't going to be involved. And that's a really dangerous situation for all concerned. And so we feel very legitimate that our work in targeting this underrepresented community and telling them what they've got to do is to not vote a candidate, not vote the party, but vote smart to gain power. In the only elections in this state in November 3rd, the only elections on all the ballots that can't be gerrymandered is statewide elections. The only 2 statewide elections are U.S. Senator and U.S. President. And so we're going to encourage people of color. There's 700,000 people of color that aren't voting with regularity. And there's no, none of the statewide elections have ever turned on that type of number. The biggest victory margin on a presidential race is maybe 250,000 votes. And that statewide race for governor, 130,000 last 3 general elections. And so there's a sleeping giant that can't exercise power because the way gerrymandering is done, they can only win certain safe seats. They can only elect certain people in the Black caucus that are minority, that even if they're good people, can't get anything done in the legislature. And so if you expose the rigged nature of the game, it opens up, I think, a legitimate line of argument for us to say, we're going to encourage people to vote in the statewide races, simply because that's the only place you can measure your effect. You can do something that really rocks the boat. From that, you gain power, you gain incentive, you gain some experience, and then you can maybe change some things. And it doesn't need to be said that the presidential candidates appear to be this guy named Trump and this man named Biden. And on the U.S. Senate side, it's Lindsey Graham versus Jamie Harris. Harrison has not won the primary yet, but it appears that he's likely to do so. So that's the Missing Voter Project. As we are doing it in the pandemic world, that's just that niche market with the young kids in those two counties. As soon as we get the results back from our pandemic model that we're using, we have some list that we have in our database that we subscribe to. A surprisingly high percentage of phone numbers, more than I'd say in Richland County, there's 240,000 voters, and we have maybe 100,000+ phone numbers, 90,000 phone numbers. And so that's enough people to be able to call and push to get involved. And we can break that out by race and age and income level. And we're doing the same thing with the Fair Maps project. I'm going to talk a little bit about Fair Maps. Is that's our gerrymandering effort. And that we have a very novel plan that has never been done in America. And that there's 3 or 4 states, I can't remember, that actually have the ability for citizens to take up petitions and put a question on the general ballot to change the state's constitution. We can't do that. 27 states can't do that. And so the states that have changed, that have taken the power to draw the districts away from the politicians that run the districts, the only states that have been able to do that were the states that allowed a constitutional amendment. And that we can't do that. So how do we get there from here? If the courts won't save us and the legislature is not going to give up power, what can we do? And so our Fair Maps plan has an answer to that. And I would challenge you to go to Fair Maps. It's fairmapssc.com. You can get there through our website or just go directly to fairmapssc.com. And you can see we have also a pandemic model there. And what we're going to do is to deliver Richland County as a model this year. We've got 2 counties picked out for the pandemic model. And that's Horry, which is a very Republican county, and Richland County, which is a very Democratic county. And we need 15% of the people in that county to sign a petition to the county council. And that petition to the council says that if the council will get the petition when we get 15,000 plus a few. We're shooting for Labor Day week, and we'll turn those petitions into the city, to the county council. And the county council has a month to make sure that those are legitimate voters. We will have checked that before. And that the council then shall, S-H-A-L-L, shall, it's in the law, the council shall adopt the citizens initiative or put it on the ballot for the citizens to vote on. And so the way that shapes up is that because of gerrymandering, reducing the participation in elections, our 15% is likely going to be more than any of the council people got. So they will be inclined to say, oh, well, we're going to do this. And we're going to take up those petitions in a strategic fashion in the districts of the legislators that won't agree to let us vote on, taking the power of drawing the maps away from them. And so this is a long game. It's a movement building operation, and it's one that can actually win. It's going to take time, but I understand it's taken some time to have an equal rights amendment passed in South Carolina. It's been many, many, many years since 1919 when the women first got the right to vote. And we still don't have equal rights amendment in South Carolina. So these things take time, but this is a good plan and we're sticking with it. Read more about it. We're having regular Fair Maps meetings and you can sign up to be at those meetings. I'm going to stop now for any questions on the Fair Maps or Missing Voter Project.
You know, I think I saw that Todd was going to say something a few minutes ago. He wants to take the floor briefly.
Go for it, Todd.
Yeah, there's
I'm going to give you
for the. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll give you the screen too.
For the 2010 Columbia Urban League State of Black South Carolina, I and a graduate student wrote a piece that is very much hearkening to what Brett's been talking about, but in Brett's sense, a more granular sense of it. The piece was entitled "The More Things Change, the More They Stay the Same," and we were looking at sort of questions of African-American voter empowerment in South Carolina. And I share this very briefly because it's a parallel story to what Brett has offered about this whole question around redistricting, and we did talk in that piece, and I'll share that piece with you if I haven't, Brett, even though it's a bit dated. You know, we talked about this you know, move in the mid '90s in toward redistricting, and that the compromises Black legislators struck in order to have majority minority districts, with the presumption that this would guarantee minority representation from these districts. But then it, as voting rights scholars talk about, it blanches, if you will, the counties or the districts in other ways. If, you know, there's a difference between, and I think Clyburn has even conceded this, there's a difference between having a district 60% African-American, when really you only need 45% when you combine that with the 10% of whites who would vote for that candidate. And so you don't, so it's a lumping effect, as many of you know this literature, it's a lumping effect of that Black vote. So we talked about that in this piece. But likewise, to Brett's point about the Legislative Black Caucus, and I smile every time I think about this. I co-wrote this with Willie Black, who was a professor at Benedict College, was my doctoral student at the time. And we wrote in that piece, because Willie later turned this into his dissertation, looking at sort of African-American legislative behavior in South Carolina. And he did a fairly deep analysis of a series of votes over the course of the '90s and 2000s, mapping where Black legislators were voting. But prior to him finishing his dissertation, we wrote this piece. And in that piece, we talked about, well, there's not enough Black legislators do not constitute a majority, or they can't, there's the missing middle of moderate and liberal white Democrats or white, even moderate Republicans who would join with the caucus to create a majority. So they're a permanent minority within the legislature. And so even if they wanted to do certain things, they don't have the legislative power to do it. One of the members of the Legislative Black Caucus wrote the president of my university when he read that, saying, Dr. Shaw is denigrating the Legislative Black Caucus. And wrote the president and wrote my department chair, stating, in fact, that I'm denigrating the Legislative Black Caucus. And our point was that because of this redistricting deal that was struck, you don't have enough sort of African-American voters pulling the candidates in certain ways. If 1/4 of your district is African-American, you have to appeal to African-American voters. But if all the African-American voters are lumped in another district, you don't have to worry about it. And so you have a lack of moderate legislators as a result, who might be willing to join with the caucus. And that's the point we were trying to convey. I didn't get in trouble, but I kept that letter as a badge of honor that someone read some research and made him mad enough to write my president.
Thank you, Todd. Let me very briefly point out the really important element of our Fair Maps plan. And it is reflective of the maps that were presented by Gilda Cobb-Hunter and the ones we supported in the 2010 election. After the census in 2010 and the maps were redrawn, all the maps on the Republican side of the table had 6 Republican districts and 1 Black district, Clyburn. All the maps on the other side of the aisle had 2 majority Black districts. And Gilda's maps were the only ones that had no majority Black district. And I was like, oh my goodness, what do you mean? And what we mean is we're looking for good government. We're not just looking for some kind of token Black representation by packing all these people into one. What Todd said about everybody gets to vote, but your vote is diluted. So what we want and what the Fair Maps is calling for is competitive districts, where the winner has to represent people that don't look like them. And that would mean that they would have to talk to everybody. Right now, with the way the thing is gerrymandered, the 8.6% of the registered voters, it was at 230,000 people, elected the majority of the legislature in the 2016 election in the Republican primary. The Republican primary, the last time we had a 4-year election, the Senate still serving, 8.6% of the people elected a majority of the legislature in the Republican primary. And that means that you only have to talk to your primary voters, and you can be an absolute stark raving wacko. Not to suggest that our legislators are absolutely stark raving wackos, but it looks like that sometimes. So our plan is competition, where people have to speak to everyone in a district. And that's the way we'd like to see districts drawn. And so is there another question queued up there we need to deal with, Robert?
I do want to add, before we get into the question too, that while I don't want to say that history repeats itself, it is worth noting the parallel between when we talk about voting today versus voting just after Reconstruction, where you have not just South Carolina, but you look at the South as a whole in the last 30 years or so, it is, with some exceptions, sliding very much back to one-party rule, except in this case, it's the Republican Party that's in control. And what you're seeing happening in South Carolina that Brett has described, that Todd has written about, what's happened here in the state in terms of voting is a microcosm of a larger problem across the entire South, where if you look at voting trends and voter turnout, it's actually quite low. And then you look at the United States as a whole, our voter turnout as a nation is actually quite low in comparison with other Western democracies and so forth. And so we should think about how, while history does not repeat itself, I don't want to say it rhymes, at times history does get remixed here and there. And so now what we're seeing is another concern about how Black voting strength has been diluted in a different way, in a way that will, again, require all of us to think creatively about things like the Fair Maps Project, but not just here in South Carolina, but across the region, how there's, since I've been politically active and aware, there's always been this talk of a sleeping giant of voters of color all across the region that could dramatically change the politics of the region. And yet no one has really figured out a way to get that voter base fully mobilized election after election.
I will add this because it is important to, Cabral said, don't, tell no lies, claim no easy victories, but there is a victory to be claimed in that you have seen increased voter turnout in the last several election cycles, last 4 election cycles, and increased voter turnout overall. And so sometimes I have to kind of give some sense, well, I try to balance people's perspective or give what I think is a balanced perspective to say, it's not that, so if you look at 2000, I know we're looking at presidential level, so I know we're looking at 30,000 foot level, but even in South Carolina, we've seen some rates tick up. And so when you see, sort of the 2008 levels, if we will, we're now at sort of a certain plateau. Even 2016, I know the whole question was, well, the Black vote went down in 2016. Well, the Black vote didn't go down to 1984 levels or something. It went down roughly, a little lower than 2008. So we are at a moment when more folk are voting and there are greater levels of turnout. The question is how to further capitalize on it. So I don't want us to sort of, sometimes I think folks that will say, well, people aren't voting. They have been voting for a long while. No, actually, turnout is on an uptick. and there are historic numbers of folk voting, notwithstanding what happened in 2016 for African-American voters. And there's a whole bunch of things we could talk about if we don't want to take time, but there's a whole bunch of things we could talk about, even how affected the Black vote. So let's claim some victory in that these numbers are going up, even though there's a lot of work to be done, very much to Brett's point, at the grassroots level and in this state.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. I want to...
Can I ask you, because I'm listening to you guys divulge all these plans, and can I just ask where, if anything, there's been a conversation about increasing your numbers of accessible voters, people with disabilities turning out to vote? Have you compared the Rutgers studies or the Foundation numbers?
Yeah, one of the things that has been a drum that we've been beating, you can certainly be helpful with our election protection hotline, is monitoring the curbside voting. It's just terrible, terrible. And we've been able to get some response. the solution is money, and we can't get money, but we've been able to get the precincts to actually post cell phone numbers of people inside. So when people come up to curbside voting, they can call the number that's on the sign that says curbside voting. Because we know, and we also want election protection workers to be at precincts, as many as we can to cover, to make sure that the people that can't walk can vote. And the SCP&A, South Carolina Protection Advocacy, Maggie something, we've been giving them data, and we've given Able South Carolina opportunity to participate in this. And I'm hoping that you can help strengthen that effort to ensure that the law requires curbside voting. And there's not enough poll workers, they're not paid enough. And so citizens are, unfortunately, it's up to us to help step up and make sure that the curbside voting is functional.
Right now, as we speak, I'm actually working on a webinar to teach people about their voting rights. So I'm learning right along with them because I don't know what my rights are in South Carolina. Having voted in one election since I've been here, and so there was that. But what I am curious too is that when you're looking at new polling locations, are you judging them also in proximity to public transportation?
No, that's something that public transportation in South Carolina is generally for poor Black people to get them out of the cities before dark. And John Ando can speak to that because he's the director of COMET now, the Central Midlands Regional Transit Authority. That's only been recently that we have a transit situation that is improving in that aspect. And I think that in certain locales, you can work with people like Ando to see that there is transportation to precincts. In the rural areas, it's just simply not possible. There's no public transportation. We have 2,300 plus precincts. The idea there was that they're all real close to where you live, and that that helps transportation-wise. And we're encouraging people this year to vote from home, and that in the general election we'll be pushing that. But your question about transportation is not something that is easy to deal with because there's no transportation system. We have the regional transportation authorities, which is federally funded. And John Ando's on the call tonight, and he's the director of the Central Midlands Regional Transit Authority, which reaches out and brings people to Columbia and sends them back to where they come from. It deals with several counties. John, do you have any comments on transportation for precincts and elections? I don't know if he may not be still with us. I don't see John with us. But anyway, Tiffany, I'll introduce you to the people that Brittany that works at the COMET and is one of the disability advocates that works with us.
She's a coworker of mine too. Yeah.
And so she's plugged into the COMET, and John Ando is now looking at me. I don't know whether he's going to comment or not whether he's hearing me. But this is something that is an ongoing project. We've been doing that. We need your help and appreciate it. Because it's the law. All 2,300 precincts are supposed to have the curbside voting to allow people that can't walk to the polls to be able to vote. And so I'm going to go back to something here that I want to share with you before we're going to talk about racial profiling project, and then we'll do some lighter engagement. I'm going to share my screen. The racial profiling project started as a racial justice project. The racial justice project is a piece of that. When we founded the network in '96, there was a consensus that racism is something that is, you can follow the thread and find it affecting everything from education to housing to transportation. And that what Dr. Shaw just mentioned about how or that might have been Dr. Greene, but one of them mentioned about how we're switching. Oh, it's Dr. Greene. We have moving back towards a one-party system. But really important to point out that the previous one-party system, when we had the Solid South, after the party of Lincoln, that Solid South was Democratic. and it was the racist party. And gerrymandering has brought you the party now that is the dominant party in South Carolina, and it's not the party, it's the color, it's the white party. And so if you had any question about what's driving, you know, politics in this state and in the South, it's race. And that I did in 2000 a study on, we look in terms of taking a bite out of racism. There's this old saying that Modjeska had, that what's bred in the bone can't be beat out of the flesh. And so the racism is so integrated into the culture, literally into the laws, that people don't even realize that, like for instance, voter registration. Voter registration is a rare concept in the civilized world. It was designed to keep people from voting. It wasn't, you know, it's like designed to basically for white guys that were over 21 that own property to be able to vote. And there's so many laws like that that are in the fabric that it's just very difficult to take a bite out of racism. So where do you start? And so we decided we were going to start with criminal justice, because you can actually count the bodies, the people that are impacted by the criminal justice system. And most of us know that for quite some time now that we now have half the young men of color in South Carolina are involved somehow in the criminal justice system, either in jail, on probation, awaiting trial. And it's genocide. It's virtually genocide of an entire, it's spread out over more than one generation now. So I did this study about how many people were being arrested in South Carolina, and I couldn't believe the numbers. And I kept running the numbers, and I'm okay, I believe these. And I got together with Joe, Representative Neal, and in the decade of the 90s, I did the study in 2000, in the decade of the 90s, it's like 9.6% of the entire Black population was arrested every year. And it's like, wow, because there's no other industrial nation that even has 1%. The United States of America is like, I think it's collectively like 3%, and people of color nationally is making up a larger percentage of that. But South Carolina is off the chart. And that it gave us, okay, now what do we do about that? Well, let's look at racial profiling. And maybe we can inhibit racial profiling that will help reduce that, or at least raise consciousness. And so we did town hall meetings. I'm giving you kind of like an organizing approach to doing something around a policy issue that is reflective of a problem that is a generic problem that society is trying to deal with. So here's the racism, here's the criminal justice disparities, and so let's do town hall hearings on racial profiling. And we had a hearing in Charleston and one in Columbia to standing room only. And we did the one in Columbia in the Brown building, excuse me, the Block building where the House of Representatives are. And we had Ernest Finney, who's the Chief Justice, we had the sheriff, we had some legislators taking testimony from people. Is racial profiling a problem? And it was quite compelling, quite compelling. Mothers getting up, talking about how they were afraid to let their children go out, or talking about being in the back seat, you know, watching this happen, just story after story after story. A SLED agent telling a story off, we put it in the record, he wouldn't testify in public. McKinley Washington was the first Black SLED agent. Being stopped, driving a SLED car, the cop comes up to him and looks in the car and he goes, "Oh, are you a police officer?" And McKinley Washington said, "Yes." And the guy said, "Excuse me," and turned around and walked off. And McKinley was going, "What if I wasn't the cop?" And so the stories were just really compelling. Good news coverage. I worked up legislation that was based on one they passed in Missouri as a bill to mitigate racial profiling that requires all cops to report all stops. And we wrote this bill and introduced it in 2002, and it went nowhere. You may remember in 2001, there was this 9/11 happened, and racial profiling kind of came back in vogue. And so it wasn't going to go anywhere until 2006. The federal government said any state that doesn't have a mandatory seatbelt bill will lose all their federal highway money. And we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. And so even the rednecks in the legislature decided that maybe we needed a racial profiling bill to keep that money flowing. And they passed, that was the deal. They went to the caucus. Oh, I missed the point. The bill was entered into as a deal with the Republicans in the Black Caucus to get the Republicans to support it because Mark Sanford vetoed the bill. The legislature had passed the bill, and that the governor vetoed it, and that vetoed the bill to do the seatbelt, the mandatory seatbelt bill. So they passed a bill that did not have racial profiling in it. They passed the seatbelt bill. The governor vetoes it because libertarians don't want the government getting between their head and their windshield. So it went back to the body, and the Republicans are cutting a deal with the Black Caucus because they got to come up with 60% of the votes to override the governor's veto. And the Black Caucus said, well, we want the racial profiling bill added to that. And the Republicans said, okay, and we thought we won. We celebrated and had a racial profiling bill. There's what's called a tolling period. When you write a bill, it identifies the state agency generally that's going to implement the bill. And that was the Department of Public Safety in the bill. I wrote the bill. And so the agency will come back to the requisite Senate committee with the regulations they wrote to enforce the law the Senate approved. And so that came before the Senate Transportation Committee. And I'm there, and I did not recognize our bill. It was the bill that actually was codified by the conference committee. When the House and the Senate have a slightly different version of something, it goes to a conference committee that's appointed by the heads of both bodies. And there were 5 white guys on this conference committee looking at the variance in the racial profiling bill. And they decided, well, they don't need all cops. Let's just give them warning tickets. And so our bill went from all cops report all stops to all cops report what amounts to non-custodial tickets, which are warning tickets. And so that was a letdown, but it became law. And so right now you can go to the Department of Public Safety, and you can look at the it's called Public Contact Report. And you can see every police agency in South Carolina that can write tickets has to report every month the race, the gender, ethnicity, and the age of everybody they stop and don't take to jail. And so there are like 800,000 or 900,000 people in that database every year. And so that database still gives us a tremendous organizing tool to look at racial disparities in the way policing's done. North Charleston, historically off the chain. Mount Pleasant is number 1. Mount Pleasant, you're 6 times as likely to be stopped if you're black in Mount Pleasant as white people. And so these are tools that are in the toolkit. If you go to the Racial Profiling Project and you get this toolkit, and that tells you how to find your, I don't know if this is going to take us to the most recent report. They've moved stuff at the Department of Public Safety. But the Department of Public Safety posts the returns for all police agencies. I mean, and you can see some of the colleges, I don't think Benedict's ever been in compliance. And what we encourage people to do was to use this tool for local organizing. Anywhere in the state, you've got at least 2 cop shops looking over your shoulder, and you can go to them, and you can either, if they're current, you can thank them, and you can say, would you support adding all cops to this database? Or if they're not current, you criticize them and want to know why. So, but one of the things we found in the few places that people had the initiative to do that, again, remember, we don't have resources, we don't have much in the way of staff, so there's a lot of projects that we create like this for people to do. And when we're doing our movement building, we take an issue, racism, we come up with a way to take a bite out of it, the racial profiling monitoring. We actually pass legislation that results in a tool that people can use anywhere in the state to address the issue of racial profiling. It probably won't stop it, but if you use it, it will mitigate it. And so that is an example of the type of approach that we have to movement building around real problems, that this one actually resulted in a law being passed. And that we now have a situation where people in this class, if they wanted to, and Dr. Shaw, you need to pay attention to this, that the head of the Highway Patrol, for the first time in South Carolina's history, is a gentleman of color, Colonel Williamson. He thinks that we need to move to all cops report all stops. Big friend of Joe Neal's, and he knows it, and Clementa Pinckney. And these are the 2 sponsors of the bill. And Leroy Smith, the head of the Department of Public Safety, a person of color, and he's being replaced. But there's an opportunity to bring this up because we now know that the Highway Patrol has an automated system that will do all this automatically. And that's been one of the only arguments about it is, oh, it'll take time away from the police chasing some bad people. Nope, it's all done anyway. Because the insurance companies want to know, to be able to charge you how much they're going to charge you, they want all the data. And so there's this system set up for the insurance companies that is amazing. And we can have a field trip out to the Department of Public Safety, see this big screen on the wall, and if you've got a ticket, you can give them the number off your ticket. They can punch a button, a little light lights up where you were stopped. You click it, you see the officer, you see what you're charged with, everything's there. And so this is much easier demand now if we had somebody to ride herd on that. So I now want to share with you a very exciting opportunity, a rare opportunity, to hear Representative Joe Neal speaking to a whole bunch of people about a moral budget. Now, let me tell you that before we do this, the moral budget fight was a historic fight that does not need to stop. In 2010, the legislature, Republican-controlled legislature, passed a bill to create a thing called the Tax Realignment Commission, TRAC, the TRAC Commission. And they studied where's our tax money coming from? And they found out, much to most people's surprise, in this nearly 700-page document, that that year we took up maybe 2.5, 2.6 billion in sales tax and left about 3 billion on the table through exemptions. And there's this long list of exemptions that's kind of embarrassing because nobody can remember where they came from. They came from smart lawyers and lobbyists. Like, I want to meet the lobbyists that got the porta-toilet concessions a 3% sales tax. There's one that everybody knows about, how we had a $300 cap on vehicles. That was a $300 cap if you bought an airplane that cost millions of dollars, a $300 cap if you bought a yacht that cost millions of dollars, $300 cap on a Eldorado Cadillac, and a $300 cap on that used Chevy you bought. And so clearly a regressive tax. If you lifted that one tax and did some across the board thing, you would raise enough money from that one tax to have covered the Medicaid expansion that was being refused because we couldn't afford $160 million that year. And so knowing, follow the money is really important. And so we had raised some hell about the fact that when they did this budget, TRAC Commission, find out where the money's coming from. And we found this extra money. Mike Fanning was one of our members. We worked really closely with Dr. Fanning. He's a PhD educator who's now a senator. He gives us credit for winning his Senate seat. And Fanning went around and got 30-something chambers of commerce to support the notion that we use this money to fund education. And what the legislature voted on was we need to use this money, this excess money that we found, to lower taxes. And that's the type of insanity that we're protesting. And I'll show you what it looks like in real life here. Let's see. Are you seeing that screen? Robert,
Yes.
you see the screen?
Yes.
Let's be clear. Let's be clear about why we're here. Yes, sir. Let's be clear about what we're going to do now that we're here. Yeah. First, let me tell you that we're here demanding justice. And lastly, let me tell you what we're going to do. We're going to keep on demanding. On Monday, the House will begin deliberations on the budget. And on Monday, we want you to come and pack the hall. We want you to look these legislators in the face and tell them we want a moral budget. They need to hear from you and people like you. Because too often those who dwell and work in this building behind me never get to see the people they hurt. This time it's going to be different. This time they're going to hear from the people. And I hope that you agree with me in saying that to those who say there is no use, that there's nothing that can be done, that things are going to be the way they're going to be, I hope you join with me in saying to them, that's a lie. I want you to turn to your neighbor, look your neighbor in the eye, and say, we're not giving up. We're not going to quit. We're going to keep fighting to fund the moral budget. God bless
Yes, see, that's why he's my minister. That's why he's my co-chair. He is not a politician. I want to close by giving you some instructions. The instructions are to organize, to join a movement. If you don't like ours, start your own. We'll work with you. But Donna DeWitt and Joe Neal have been working to build this thing into a democratic movement that represents the interests of people. A good political force grows from an organized popular movement. We have to make that movement. We have to show people that it makes a difference to care. And the way that you can do that most immediately is by being in that building this coming Monday at 11:30. This shirt that I have on. You can own one of these shirts if you come to the lobby at 11:30. You can pick them up on the other side of the Confederate flag. And I want to say that I've been here in South Carolina competing with third world countries for the last 30 or 40 years. Telling people up north, y'all come on down, our workers is stupid, they work cheap, we smash unions, we don't have any environmental regulations, come on down. And you know what's happening now, folks, with Nikki Haley? She's deciding we do not have to compete with third world nations, we can be one.
This is us mobbing the lobby.
I said there were 40 people out on the step with signs, and a group of them at that moment were in the lobby and started chanting. Which is not allowed. Stop the cut! Stop the cut! Stop the cut! And the speaker's eyes got this big. I said, they're coming. So he said, we'll work out something. So we, instead of having 20% cut, we had what? 5%. And a lot of things didn't get cut that would have gotten cut. So a lot of it, whether it received any press or not, that rally had an impact.
This is a rally that was in 2014 to demand Medicaid be expanded at the State House. It was on a rainy, cold January morning, the first day of session. A very difficult time to turn out people on a Tuesday in a rainy, cold January. And we were really worried because at 10 there was nobody there.
Co-chair of the South Carolina Professional Network and Chair Emeritus. He has been chosen to make a few remarks about his position and the delegation here's position on Medicaid expansion.
Good afternoon. My colleagues and I are here to voice our support for Medicaid expansion. As I think about what is being proposed in South Carolina to stop the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, as I think about the refusal to accept $11 billion to expand Medicaid, when I think about the fact that we've turned down 44,000 jobs that would be associated with the expansion of Medicaid, when I think about the fact that some 1,300 people a year will die because they will not have access to health care, when I think about all of that, I simply have to respond, enough is enough. The reality is enough is enough. How do we as a state find it even something we would consider to deny health care to our own citizens? How could we defend such a decision to allow people to simply suffer and die? Government is supposed to be about the business of taking care of people. And certainly it has now become about big business and big dollars, and people are pushed aside. My colleagues and I are here today to simply say to you that we pledge our support to continue the fight, to expand Medicaid, to make sure that our people have an opportunity to live. I don't think that's too much to ask, do you? While we're here, we also want to include in this call for the expansion of Medicaid a call to make sure that when we talk about health care, that we don't forget mental health. Recent article in the Atlantic Monthly talked about the status and condition of mental health patients in the Department of Corrections. One man was locked in solitary confinement for over 2,000 days, with his mental health continuing to decline, lying there in his feces and his urine for over 2,000 days. Is that the kind of health care that we want to be associated with in South Carolina? Enough is enough. We ask you to do something as we leave this podium today. Gathering here and raising our voices is a good thing, but it's not enough. We need each one of you to become change agents. We need you to go out in the highways and the byways and compel them to come and vote. It is only then that the voice of the people can be heard. We ask you to do so and do it as expeditiously as you can, and make sure that you leave no one behind. God bless you, and enough is enough. I'd like to introduce my colleagues who are here with us today.
Well, there's a long piece with music and drums and marching people after that. That's pretty powerful stuff. And if you were there, I'm sure you remember it. If you weren't, I'm sorry you missed it. We'll have to do it again, because we still have not expanded Medicaid, and there are more compelling reasons now why we should. And I'm going to be, we worked with the Harvard School of Public Policy, health policy, and Joe Neal did. And we had actually a staff person from the school come down and speak about the studies that they'd done, that number that Representative Neal quoted of 1,300 people dying. That was a Harvard number. and we laid that right at Nikki's door. It doesn't seem to matter to the people that continue to elect people, that those that are killing people get elected, and it's happening again. And we're going to see a greater impact on those people that don't have insurance in South Carolina. But what I want to ask before we just take general questions, if any of our officers or staff people out there that are with us this evening have something to mention that I have forgotten to lift up.
Can I just invite people to our YouTube channel, which is where this playlist that Brett was calling those videos from. We've got lots of really wonderful clips there. Some of them are better quality than others. They all have a lot of heart and really fantastic people and fantastic memories. And I think that you would be gratified to look at them when you have some downtime. And I just got to say that I really miss Representative Neal so very much. And we wouldn't be here without him.
Mm. Thank you, Becky. Representative Neal performed, I married our communications director. It's a way to keep her on the job. And Representative Neal performed our ceremonies 11 years ago. Anybody else on our staff or executive committee? Wayne, Kyle, Daniel? Okay. Well, Robert, let's take some questions and I'll turn the meeting back over to you.
Sure. So any questions about what we've discussed tonight in terms of the SCPN's overall history, what it's currently up to in terms of events and so forth? Certainly we want to hear from you guys if you have any questions or comments.
I have a question. Before you were talking about the followthemoney.org, and I put a question out there on the chat. How does that correspond with the Citizens United decision? I mean, how much can they track on as far as the donations from corporations or whatever? Because the Citizens United basically mask all that sort of thing. It's basically disguised.
Well, it depends where the money goes. The money's tracked at the recipient level. And in South Carolina, the legislators have to divulge what they get from various sources. And that Citizens United really isn't through the front door of a campaign committee. Citizens United is dealing with third-party things. So the Progressive Network's Political Action Committee could take up $1 million. We don't have to tell where it's coming from because that's free speech. Now, the money that goes into a legislative campaign, federal and state, you have to divulge when you give to a legislator. But you and I can start a third-party operation. The Citizens United was a organization that was a anti-abortion group that felt that their voice was being silenced because they couldn't spend money. They had people that wanted to give them money and they didn't want to have to tell people who they were. And so that ruling kept secret the money that flows into campaigns through that third-party channel, the political action committees, and the 501c4s like we have. We can spend unlimited amount of money, don't have to tell anybody who it is. That's what that restricts. And yes, that is not reported because it is not divulged because it's not reported. But that which it is that the legislators get is certainly enough to kind of indicate whose side they're on. Does that answer your question, Wes?
Yeah, can you elaborate a little bit more? Is that the difference between hard money and soft money? Am I getting that term right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the hard money is recounted. And that if you give money to a legislator, if you write a check to Mike Fanning, our senator guy, Mike's going to have to report it. And that there's limits that you can give money in the feds. I think for like the race for Senate that right now against Lindsey Graham or Harrison can only take $2,800 from an individual.
Yeah.
And there are limits as to how much you can give in South Carolina. It's $1,000 for House members and Senate members. It changes every once in a while, but there's certain limits on how much you can give, and there's certainly ways around it, but people bundle money. And like a corporation, like a law firm, corporation can't give money, the law firm can't give money, but they can have an independent political action committee within their group that takes up money and makes a contribution to a legislator.
Okay.
So Brett,
So the political strength is in the political action committees.
Yeah, the political action committees. I mean, certainly there's a lot of money that comes over the transom that is divulged. But right now, there's literally, I think, in a presidential year, going to be billions of dollars that's not accounted.
so
This,
Brett,
this is something, Wes, that I would like to have like a workshop on. And we'll talk about money in depth.
Brett, as a 501c4, then you function for all intents and purposes as a super PAC. Is that right?
Well, there's 527s, and yeah, you could call it a super PAC if we were supercharged with money. But the ability to be able to take private money and affect elections is something that we've done on a very small but strategic basis. And in 2018, we've got all the maps in front of us. We know which elections can be changed. And our strategy is that the political parties we're not hooking up our wagon to a political party to lead us to the promised land. What we're trying to do now as a democratic popular movement is to build power. Because if we don't have power, we can't get anything done. So the way that you get power in the political arena is being able to either reward someone or punish someone. And so in 2018, one of the races that we were looking at, very close race, that is in a district that's about 48% people of color. And the representative, Samuel Rivers, the only black member of the Republican Party in the South Carolina House of Representatives. And Mr. Rivers voted against the interests of the young black people that we happen to have the names and addresses of in that district that didn't have health insurance. And so we felt it was incumbent on us to do some voter education, and we mailed 5,800 pieces of mail to young black people in Mr. Rivers' district, pointing out that he was opposed to them having health care. Representative Cobb Hunter cut a robocall for us, and that went out, and we had Omari Fox, who you heard from a little while ago. We put Omari's phone number and called people with a robocall with Gilda, and they called Omari back, and I think Omari Rivers got well over 100 calls back, which is pretty rare. And so I'm here to say that we did not collaborate. We did not collaborate or collude with the Democratic candidate. It was a young man named J.A. Moore. We checked him out. His sister was killed in the Emmanuel 9 killings, and he is now a representative from Berkeley County who won by 170 votes. And he wouldn't have won if we hadn't done that. That's powerful. Nobody knew that. He didn't know that, but other people did.
That was a state level race. Nothing impedes you from participating in federal races. Is that right?
Nothing except the fact it's futile. And we're a little more strategic than that.
But in the two statewide federal races next year, the Senate races, of those two, one is up for re-election next year.
Right, and that we can do a parallel C4 campaign for a federal candidate. We've never done federal before. This instant where we're promoting the fact of the reason you're voting is to make a noise. We count races that I can go back after the election and tell you how many black people voted from what counties. We can measure black voting strength like never before because we're encouraging people of color to vote in a statewide election that everybody can vote in, as opposed to the little gerrymandered districts that you can vote in that don't do any good. And so we could also have a parallel campaign that was paid for that could be more cutting edge. We do things in a nonpartisan fashion strategically, not just legally, but strategically, because we don't want to be seen as big. Good example. One of my old comrades, somebody I've known for 40 years, stone cold revolutionary. I'm trying to talk him into helping with this campaign, our missing voter campaign, to mobilize black people. And his response was, I can go do a damn thing for Jamie Harrison. He's got enough money and he can pay me if I work for him. And I got mad at this guy because I said, you know me, I'm not here to get Jamie. I mean, my issue is beyond this election. My issue is beyond candidates. My issue is building a powerful popular movement. Because the fact of the matter is, we can get Democratic candidates elected, but may I remind you that Obama was the one that gave all the money to the Wall Street, and that Obama was the one that approved arms sales to Saudi Arabia. That there's things that happen that aren't in the Democrats' power, or it is in their power, but either way, it doesn't turn out well. And you well remember that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he got elected, he said, I know the right thing to do, but you got to make me do it. And then when Jimmy Carter won, Ralph Nader said, you can elect a straight man, but it's a crooked office. And so we have systemic problems. And if we get hung up with trying to fix the problems with the tools that maintain them, you can't get there from here. So I'm not in the least opposed to people working to see the candidate elected that's going to lower the death count, raise the educational level, make it easier to live in America, make it easier to be in a third world country and not have your village bombed by America. But those liberties are something that are balanced off against America's economic interest, and America's economic interest runs the show. And when you see, if we had conventions that were advertised on television this year, you would see the ads around the thing like a football stadium from the same companies that support the Republicans and the Democrats. So you're right, Steve. So we do want to have another meeting that deals with some of these specifics like money and politics and an electoral plan. We need, I'm not suggesting we've got all the answers and we've got some really good ideas, but we need to sharpen everything and can use all of your inputs.
I have one last question. I apologize, Brett, and I'll quit this. Is the entity that is the decision-making body of your C4 the same as the decision-making body of your C3?
The decision-making body of both bodies is the general membership. Now, when you pay your dues, you are in the general membership. Now, the C3, let's say the SCEA, I saw an SCEA officer on the steps of the State House when Joe Neal was speaking.
That was Jackie Hicks.
And that the C3 has votes in the general membership, right, but that it's running a bit of a different, different legal track than the general membership that would decide what we're going to do with the C4. Again, the bylaws are posted under this little button that says about the network. Any more questions? So, Representative McDaniel, are you still out there? We've got a few more minutes here, and I was going to let you speak to your inaugural term in office as a legislator representing Fairfield County, where I understand very little is fair.
Hey.
Hey. You may not want to say anything, Annie. I'm putting you on the spot, and you can just say that you choose not to answer the question.
No. I don't mind. It's a very busy job, and I've been listening to a lot of your characterization, and that may not be the best word, of things that have happened. Just speaking off the cuff without really giving it a lot of thought. And it's not difficult for me to speak off the cuff because I consider myself an advocate, an activist, and one who is very entrenched in justice, freedoms, fairness, equality, and all those things that truly make the United States of South Carolina great. Now, my experience at the State House has been very, very interesting since we have 82 Republicans and about 42 Democrats, and how everything is so straight down the middle and so polarized, and how decisions that one would think would be so simple to make when putting laws in place to benefit all citizens is not so simple. One of the most recent was we requested that since DHEC was being pushed, and rightfully so, to do what's the terminology, tracing, so that if you have the virus, then you give up the names of anybody and everybody you've been around so they can be notified. And there being requests to follow the guidelines and self-quarantine. So we asked, well, can we just take, can we have the, we would like to have the witnessing removed. There's enough other information to ensure that the person submitting the ballot, that ballot does belong to that person. And had we been able to get a good response and reason as to why, it probably would have been great, but we couldn't get one. So I went to the majority leader and talked to him, and he said, well, Annie, well, Rep. McDaniel, they can just take the ballot and just put it on the doorknob and just call somebody to come pick it up, and then they can witness it and take it to the office or mail it to the office. I said, really? So it's those kind of things that kind of frustrate you and make you want to just kind of, I don't want to say throw up your hands, but it make you really, really want to fight for what's right. The sad thing is that even with the numbers, that there's so many who appear to not want to see the right thing done for whatever reason. And my little short time down there, it's about our egos, as Brett stated earlier, and about the power struggle. You know, everybody want to be the first, everybody want to be in the newspaper, everybody want to be in the news, but nobody wants to say that I did the right thing because it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you,
So
Annie. You're
I want to talk some more. You shut me down? No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead, I'm done.
Be careful giving the microphone to a legislator. But Annie's learning that the downside of another downside of these safe districts is that you're in a situation where you can't win, and all you have to do is strut and fret and beat your chest and act bold. And I was at a meeting with Eric Holder had in Columbia recently about redistricting, and I'm there with my new plans and all, and the two legislators of color that were on the panel, they both assumed that we were going to lose, and they were talking about, this is what we do after we lose, and they had no fire in the belly to resist the fight. Annie, let's see if we can squeeze in a couple more people before we got a few more minutes to go.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Well, Daniel, I see you're chatting here. You want to talk out loud?
Hello. You know, my dear comrade, Wayne Borders, is on the call. And so I wanted to yield my time to him. However, of course, there's no pressure. Wayne, do you want to say a few things?
Sure. Looking into the chat and noticing definitely that new legacy project came up. Also, Daniel, you had mentioned you wanted me to circle back to, I guess, the issue of healthcare.
No, talk about New Legacy Project and why you're sticking with the network.
Wow. So the New Legacy Project was started between Daniel and, at the time, there was like another young person who was there. She kind of gave us some input, but Daniel, Kyle, and I think it was our fall conference at Penn Center. We, took stock of the fact that the network is going to continue to function to, take over when the time comes for the next wave of leadership to come. And so we began the New Legacy Project. New in terms of, the next generation of leaders, legacy, because that's what we intend to continue building upon. And it's a project because this is our thing, this is what we're doing. And so in the time that the New Legacy Project has been able to organize festival extravaganzas known as SAFE, where we use art and poetry, music, as instruments to discuss and social issues that we continue to deal with in South Carolina, using those mediums as a way to kind of break the and more approachable for people, especially specifically again, young people who, you know, as we've heard.
Wayne, your audio is breaking up, but we're only getting about every other syllable.
Oh no.
Yeah, let's ask Daniel to step in and
sure.
We've got a few seconds left here, but I wanted, you two guys drove that trailer around the state for thousands of miles.
The 10-city, 10-day tour.
Yeah, and Daniel was with Wayne, and y'all speak to that experience real briefly. Just what?
Yeah, I'll let Daniel do that one.
Yeah, Daniel.
Sure. So just a few minutes here. Let me give a very brief background, not too long, just myself and my interest in the network. Like other middle-class folks, I suppose I was radicalized in college, came to understand a different conceptualization of how the world works. So I studied Marx, Angela Davis, Du Bois, etc. And so I recognized that the two bourgeois parties were kind of rearranging chairs on the Titanic. So I wasn't quite interested in doing that. And however, I didn't see anything really to join. I didn't see a radical organization. I didn't see what Marx called socialism, which is not some abstract state of affairs in the future. Rather, it's the real movement to abolish the present state of things. And that's what I was interested in. And so one day I met this guy with a ponytail who was yelling at me to help him come move some chairs. And so that's how I was introduced to the network. And so outside of this radical analysis that's addressing the core as opposed to the symptoms, I also became appreciative of the network strategy as opposed to just protesting. And I want to give one example from our Healthy Democracy Roadshow, which was our roadshow to advocate for the expansion of Medicaid. Wayne, Kyle, Brett, Dr. Kevin Gray, many others were arrested for blocking the entrance to the State House. They were blocking Medicaid, we were blocking the entrance to the legislators' little parking garage. But we didn't do this to make ourselves feel good. The legislators said they were not going to speak about Medicaid expansion. Well, after blocking, I believe it was for 3 weeks, blocking the entrance, the media came and asked us, why are you doing this? And we said, well, go ask the legislator, why are they blocking Medicaid expansion? We forced the conversation in the legislature. It was those actions. So I saw a sequence of events that led to a concrete outcome as opposed to, you know, just waving a sign to make yourself feel good. And so I was really moved by having a tactic and a strategy. And so Wayne and I, as Brett mentioned, traveled to 10 cities in 10 days to educate folks, to develop structures, communities, etc., who were interested in advocating for Medicaid expansion, while at the same time, and though there's the Healthy Democracy Roadshow, while at the same time, I really got a glimpse of this type of working class knowledge, that people knew that we should not have a system which is predicated on profits as opposed to providing basic human requirements. And a society that does put profit first neither has nor deserves a very long existence. So I'll leave it at that, and yeah, please join us.
I can't imagine I have anything to say after that, Daniel. These are the people that are planning, hopefully, a bloodless coup to get rid of me. And so I'm really looking forward to it, and y'all chip in some money so they can quit their day jobs. Dr. Greene, I wanted to point out that our next, I think I'm calling it a deep dive now. It was a talk back last week, but we're going to do between now and the end of the class 10, this is class 7. Class 7 wraps what we refer to as the people's history. And I'm honored and proud and tired to be a part of the people's history for the last 50 years. But we're now going to move into the subjective part of our studies. We think hopefully that we're presenting a history that's fairly objective. Dr. Greene and Dr. Shaw and Dr. Hale, who's out there with us tonight, they've studied and they're getting paid to be objective and present what is. And what we're doing is what can be, what could be, what's holding us up. And so these talkbacks or deeper dives that we're going to be doing on Mondays, next Monday will be an opportunity to talk about some of the things we touched on now and to hear more questions from you. I'll send out some provocative things you can respond to. And that would be May 25th. And then the class June 1, we start looking at theory. What are the political theories? And Lewis Pitts, former attorney, the only attorney ever in North Carolina that actually was able to quit, had to sue I think he sued the Supreme Court to be able to tear up his legal papers because he felt it was unprincipled. I'll send you Lewis's goodbye statement to the legal profession. But Lewis is going to talk about corporations and the role that they play in our lives. It's everywhere. And Dr. Shaw is going to talk about the different types of systems. And so we're going to look at the opportunities that we have and the dangers we have with our theory and analysis of those things. And then we'll have a talk back after that class on June 8th. And so I'll send all this out to you. And Dr. Greene, you've got comments? You want to take us home?
No, I don't really have anything to add except, again, I want to encourage folks to continue to ask questions, to continue to really probe not just the history of South Carolina, but now really think about some of the theoretical approaches that we're going to talk about in the next few weeks when it comes to not only activism, but also organizing and agitating. So I don't really have anything else to add.
Yeah, I heard that a lot, and I still hear it. What do you people want? And we've got to have some really good answers for that. And so that's what we'll be talking about. And I'm going to turn off the recording now, and we can all click on the galley and wave goodbye. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.